Before we get started, I want to thank you for listening to Not Suitable for Work. If you haven't, take a quick second to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome to Not Suitable for Work. I'm your host, Peter C. Diamond. You think your office is nuts? Wait until you hear some of these stories.
It's a story I tell people as a cautionary tale of what not to do in a pressure-filled situation.
And there's nothing like making a joke and looking at a room full of people who, are just stone-faced, and they know that you blew it.
What about our professional dynamic has given you a license to act in this way?
We're driving, and it's taking a while. And I realize I don't think I'm going to be making it back to my hotel.
With each podcast, I interview folks who have a humorous work story to share. Along the way, I'll offer advice to help you make sense of your own office nonsense. Don't worry, no careers were harmed in making Not Suitable for Work. Names and places may have been changed to protect the not so innocent. Without further ado, let's get this show on the road. In this episode, we're going to tackle the topic of authenticity and how it got a few leaders into hot water. My guest is Anna Dutra, current president and CEO of the Executives Club of Chicago, and author of Leadershits. Yes, you heard me correctly. Leadershits. Anna is a well-regarded leader and business professional. She's seen it all while working at a Fortune 100 company, top consulting firms, and in her current position as president and CEO. Being in the C-suite, she had a front row seat to observe firsthand leadership behaviors that are disruptive not only to the company, but also to the leader. I've had the pleasure of working alongside Anna for the past 3 years as coaching advisors, and I'm thrilled to have her on Not Suitable for Work.
So you asked me for interesting, funny stories in the workplace of snafus, right? And I decided to focus on the topic of authenticity, which is so beat up these days, but still provides us with good material because the definition of authenticity is still very blurry. And I was thinking about the people over the course of my years in corporate America, as well as with clients who I met, who became funny, inauthentic leaders.
And funny not intentionally, is that?
I think that mostly unintentionally, because I truly believe nobody wakes up in the morning and say, I'm going to be as funny as I can be today. And by the way, people are going to believe it. I think that people truly believe that they are convincing others of being somebody who they are not at the end of the day. Most people have a very high image of themselves, and they construct that ideal leader who they believe they are, but they are not. And then they start to try to act as that person. But at the end of the day, when caught unguarded, who they really are comes through, right?
So that's interesting. So you think it's when people are unguarded, like when they're unguarded is when this the snafus tend to come out.
Mostly, yes. And we see that a lot when people have a microphone in front of them, but they believe the microphone...
Like we do right now.
But we know. But here's the difference. We know this microphone is on, right? Now, if you told me we're off the record now and I relax, who knows what may come out? I'm in my best behavior now. And I've seen people saying pretty horrible things when caught off guard, right? Or when they relax, that's who they truly are comes out. Or when they are under pressure, afraid, then you see people who are very composed when they are paying attention to how they want to come across, becoming reckless. I mean, we see that all the time. We see that these days. We see that in politics and in our own leadership, without getting political, but getting some all the time, right?
Absolutely. No, I love it. It's when you're right. When people get relaxed, they let their guard down, or they think they're talking off the record. So all valid points. And in the work that I do, I see it as well.
I am sure you do. And then the question becomes, how do you call people out when they are displaying those behaviors? And in particular, if you report to them, right? I'll tell you a situation. It's a true story. It's actually in my book. I worked with a guy who was a tyrant, and he could drive enormous pleasure by making other people uncomfortable. That was his power play. And I've seen CFOs not being able to do really simple math. I have seen his CIO completely not being able to articulate words, and then he would get on top of the person. And there was one particular day when we were in a meeting in his office, and he started to press so much this guy, and I could see the guy sweating and losing trend of his thoughts, and the more he did, the more he got on him. And when the guy left, I looked at this person and I said, aren't you ashamed of what you just did? I mean, this man who is usually very composed and very comfortable and very confident, he's probably throwing up in the bathroom now. And this person's response was, gosh, wasn't that fun?
So now,
in that case, he knew exactly what
he knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
And what was your role in this? So you're in the meeting. So
it was very uncomfortable because we were both direct reports to this individual. So the person who was losing his grounding was my peer. And gosh, I wanted to save him, but I couldn't. I knew it would. So what I did was I was just silent, horrified, might I add, but watching that, wanting to get out of the room, because I think that when people see others being intimidated and they can't do anything, your natural reaction is, I just want to be out of these dynamics. And when I heard that comment about wasn't this fun, I said, now I need to leave the room. Well, I just need to leave the room.
At that point, you're in a senior level position, right? So you're in this room. That's being said. So then, are you thinking this could happen to me?
Oh, I knew this would happen to me, and because it was normal behavior, right? It was the way to assert power. And there were many comments. There were comments about people's outfits. I remember somebody walked into a meeting once, and this individual said, wow, this is a really expensive purse. I must be paying you way too much. And so what starts to happen is that that's the way that the person, probably my guess, is that copes with his own insecurities. So I remember one day I walked into a meeting, and okay, I confess, I was overdressed. And you walked into the meeting and you can tell right away that you're overdressed. And I said, damn it, I'm just leaving it open, right? So I went to talk with this person, and as I hugged him, I said, if you make any comment about my dress or how I'm dressed, you are going to be publicly humiliated. Just be aware. And I think that what he thought was, somebody is crazier than me. I never got the comment. So sometimes you need to be crazier than the crazy person, so that person says, okay, I found a match. And so that's my recommendation.
No, so it's interesting. I mean, I've heard that as a tactic. So if you're with somebody who is being very, either verbally aggressive or whatever, it is to almost stand up and match that, or or to call them by their name, right?
Oh,
so to say something
interesting.
like, Anna, if you ever say anything about, then they're like, because then it becomes very personal to them. So it's another interesting tactic is call them by their name. Now, when you did this, it was also really interesting on your part is you did it very discreetly. So you did not do it in front of the room. So the likelihood of anyone else hearing it was
zero.
Was
zero.
Actually
zero. I actually spoke in the person's ears when I greeted the person.
So that's also
it's
right?
almost like saying the name, right?
It's almost like saying the name. I am right in your face, and
be aware I have something prepared for you, and you will not know where it's coming from.
Yeah, I mean that's so. But
it's toxic, no matter
it's
what,
toxic,
right?
Right? Because if you're always not, I mean, what made that really toxic is you, instead of just being authentic to you and wearing, because you do wear, you're always very well turned out. Every time I see you, you're very nicely dressed. To then have to be conscious of, well, what am I wearing? What can I talk about? Should I anything?
Any comment? It's actually stressful, but I think that people who choose to behave in that way, their way of keeping others on their toes, and therefore they are in control, is to have always an underlying level of stress in the environment, and that's what makes them shine or in control and all that.
And then, how is that business performing? Because that's the thing that I always come back to, as well as doing as an executive coach and helping people, is that in those situations, does the business perform well or well enough? And without divulging any information, but just like in general.
Well, let's qualify performance, right? Because even when those businesses financially perform well, people's performance, individual performance on a day-to-day basis suffer because the culture is so toxic. So even if you have decent financial performance, you have a level of stress, frustration in the culture that's not conducive to long-term productivity. So people leave a lot, and people who remain, I mean, you will see this story in the book. There's a story in the organization that in the level where this individual has his office, people look out their doors first before going to the bathroom because they don't want to bump into him and have the risk of being publicly humiliated. Can you imagine that?
Well, it's in past episodes, we've had people talk about the lengths that people will go to make sure that they are either not being seen like going to the restroom or wasting time or whatever because of the leadership culture there. So it's so antithetical to how you and I would think, and thankfully don't have to be in those environments anymore. But a lot of people are, and it's horrible. I mean, you can see why people are so unhappy and disenfranchised, and also why work performance and productivity becomes low. So it's a shame, and I think that's why you and I hope
there's another aspect too, Peter, and I am not sure if there's research data just confirming that or not. But one thing that I notice in those toxic environments is that you see a higher level of illness and sickness and all that. Tell you what, in this floor, there were people with gout. There were people who had heart attacks. There was one person who suffered a stroke. People were constantly physically ill. And I have to believe that it's related to level of stress. And
yeah, I agree. I think there is some anecdotal evidence out there that would say the in environments where there is, whether it's, more kindness or mindfulness, that there are, less cases of stress or illness. So I think there is some out there. But again, it's the person in power they're doing it just to kind of save their own face and reputation.
Yeah, there are some people, there are some leaders who truly believe that unless they are beating up people will not give their 100%, which I find fascinating, right? Because depending on the person, if it's with me, for example, it's going to have the reverse effect. But you see those beliefs out there.
So what else? So what else in this world of authenticity would you say?
So let's talk about overuse of authenticity, right? Which actually is very correlated to being a no filter. So it's the person who takes what you see is what you get to an extreme, and doesn't even realize. So there's a triangle here, which is the inauthentic or the too authentic, the no filter, and the self-unaware. Right? So when you're way too authentic, without any self-management or self-awareness, you become a loose cannonball. You become a no filter. The no filters, to me, come in 3 flavors. Number 1 are the ones who are absolutely oblivious to the fact that they put their feet in their mouths all the time. And these are the people who you're always nervous to take to a client, for example, right? You never know what's going to come. And they never even realize. You have to call them out and say, do you realize what you just said? And do you realize how it rubbed the person off the wrong way? Yes.
Well, it's interesting. We had in one of our previous episodes called Bumbling Boss, one of our guests talked about it. She worked for somebody early in her career who she just said, a nice guy, but would always say the most inappropriate things all the time, and really inappropriate. So yes, so that would be. So we do know about that, and they tend to be there. She thought that they were harmless, like he was harmless, like even though what he said was really inappropriate and odd. But she said he was harmless, and he never had there was no, ill intent there. So that's number 1. So what's the second flavor?
The number 2 are the ones who think they're funny, but they're not, right? So I remember once a CEO of a talent company, which is hilarious, right? And we were having a holiday party or something, and this guy who had just got engaged walks in with his fiancée, and then she tries to strike a conversation with this man who had a high reputation in assessment, and she says, so in Myers-Briggs, what is my fiancé's profile? And he looks at her and says, SHIT. And there was that blank in the room. And he thought he was hilarious, right? And people just want to die. And she didn't know what to say. The fiancé is embarrassed. So these are the ones who think they're funny and don't even realize.
And would you say they fall prey to and find humor to connect with people, right? So there is that, there are people that will say, in order to build a relationship and connect with, use humor. So I think people sometimes think, oh, I'm going to be funny. But there's, you have to make sure that either you have a relationship with that person to be funny, or you really are funny. But that's also like misguided advice that you could get, from somebody who is helping you think about how you build your brand and your presence with others. So
I think you're absolutely right, and you see this sometimes also in speeches and keynote speakers. If you make one funny comment, okay, but by the time you get to the 3rd or the 4th one, people start to get tired. So modulating that, there is value in humor, but you need to qualify and quantify humor in order to be really funny. So you're absolutely right. I'm not advocating that you should take humor away from everything, but it's just knowing how to use it, and in particular, not expose others when you do that. I think that when you start to only knowing how to be funny if you expose somebody else, then you know what? What about being self-deprecating for a change?
Yeah. Well,
right?
especially in that situation that you just mentioned, someone, I don't know, maybe this guy does have a little bit of that reputation. And who knows what if there was a little bit of an underlying jab in there as well. So I agree with you that it's challenging.
And I think there's one more thing that listening to you just made me think about. It's recognizing the hierarchies and the dynamics in the situation, given that the man who made the comment is the CEO of the organization, and the fiancé is the fiancé of a guy who's pretty junior in the organization. He already has the power position. You don't need to over-exercise it, right? So that's, and then there's the last
yes.
one. And the last one are the ones, and now we get full circle, who confuse being no filter with being authentic. So I coached the CEO who went from being the CEO of a private company to being the CEO of a public company. And he would just say whatever crossed his mind. And he got the company in trouble a couple of times, and he moved the stock price by making comments. And those were things he truly believed in, but that should not have been shared with the investor community, for example. And I remember having a conversation with him, and he started by fighting me and saying, that's why people love me, is because I am so authentic and I say exactly what I think, and that's why I have this followership and all that. I said, well, if the stock price falls 5% because of a comment you made, of course I was exaggerating, and you have to cut jobs, how good are you being to your people? What is your over authenticity doing, right? So people need to understand that sometimes with certain positions or titles comes the responsibility of knowing what to say and what to hold back on. And that doesn't mean that they're not being authentic. That means that they're being mindful and they're being good leaders. So those are really dangerous, because that type of no filter, the ones who think I am the most authentic person on earth, they just don't get it. They feel that they're right, and that's a problem.
And I think to your point is, if that's what he wants to practice, if that's the type of leadership authenticity he wants to practice, you can't do it in a publicly traded company, right?
Exactly.
So that's when you also have to know that that's not going to work, and you should never put yourself in that position, and or you have to then manage your authenticity a little bit.
That's an excellent point, because those are the times when your private life is no longer private. Your words are not just yours, because they have implications to a much, much bigger ecosystem than just people who report to you, right? They have consequences that go far and beyond your direct reports or your family only. So you need to think about that. It's huge responsibility.
And then at some point, and if there is that much tension, you have to ask yourself, do I even want to be in this, position? If there's going to be this constant tension of watching every word that I say and every action, at some point in time, you have to reevaluate and maybe say, step down or move aside or do whatever you need to do to say this probably isn't the right role.
Or if you're so miserable by not being able to say everything that crosses your mind, right? I remember many, many years ago working with a brilliant entrepreneur, and one of his companies went public. And then he had an investor relations and a PR person and this and that. And once he sat with me and he said, I think the only thing I can talk about in public is the weather. There's nothing else. And I said, well, if it is the weather, then just be prepared to talk very well about the weather. But he was right. He went from a situation where he was able to comment on and talk about anything and everything he wanted to one where he had many restrictions and limitations and confidentiality and all that. So you either adapt and you become a good, effective leader in that particular context and environment, or you have to go back to the environment where you are your most effective leader, your most effective self.
Yeah.
No one size fits all, my friend.
That's I actually talk that a lot about when I'm working with different leaders. There's no one size fits all for leadership, and understanding the situations and roles that you best thrive in as a leader is what you want to do, and navigate toward those effectively versus thinking that you can be a leader in any situation. Because I think there are different skills, and clearly we're talking about authenticity, and I'm curious to hear from you. How do you view authenticity for yourself?
That's a great question. I think it's a combination of being who I am, being a little bit of who I aspire to be. We never are 100% of who we aspire to be, and being mindful of when being who I am is going to negatively impact others, because all of us have parts of ourselves that if we just what you see is what you get, it might not be incredibly positive for somebody else. I tell this story. I am very outspoken and assertive. And when I was in law school, I had a friend who was exactly like me. So we were the kids who would sit in the front, and the professor asked something, we jumped in, and we had opinions and comments. And then we had another friend who was almost our opposite. She was very quiet, very thoughtful, very mindful. Gosh, I hate her. No, we were really good friends. And but what happened was that sometimes my outspoken friend and I would say something, and of course we talked all the time. So the professor was like, "Okay, just another comment," and then our other friend, Mary, would say exactly the same thing, but in a much more paused and mature and grounded way. And the professor would say, "Excellent thought." And I would say, well, wait a second, wasn't that what I just said? But it was a delivery, right? So my outspoken friend and I said, guess what? Let's be like her. Let's be her. So we spent a couple of days really observing how she paused before answering something, and her tone of voice, her pitch, her pace, and all that. And we said, we're going to be just like Mary. How long do you think that lasted? Not too long. We said, heck with this. I can't do this. This is going to drive me crazy. That's not who I am. But having said that, over the course of the years and over the course of having more control over my delivery and being more aware of my audience, I became much more capable of modulating, meaning that I allow myself to be all out if I'm with somebody who is super high energy too. But if I'm with somebody who is very quiet, very subdued, I slow down. And there's one technique that really works. I loved your saying the name of the person. If you want to match energy, watch how the person breathes. Usually people who are more quiet They have longer breathing cycles, and just match them, and you're going to calm down.
That's a great tip.
Naturally as well. So I do that quite a bit, in particular if I'm sitting with somebody who I don't know well. Imagine that if you are super energetic with somebody who is more calmer, and you're probably going to be overwhelming to that person, right? You can let go sometimes. My poor husband is a recipient, and he's very calm and quiet. You can just imagine. But when you want to build a relationship, and you are the one who can flex, you cannot afford many times just killing it right there because you were not self-aware.
Yeah. And I think when we talk about flexing as leaders, I believe it's the leader's responsibility to flex. Like, if you're going to be in the leadership role, you have to flex and be able to adapt and manage those situations and those people and kind of match them a little bit. I love the breathing thing. I tend to do it. I tend to be very cognizant of their body language. So I tend to match if they're leaning forward or leaning back, but I never even thought about the breath. So I love that. I think that's a fantastic thing. I'm going to add that to my list of tips to share with other people. And anything else? Any other lessons that you would like to share with our listeners about authenticity and leadership?
Well, just one more thought on being a leader and being authentic, but being mindful. Remember that when you are the leader in a situation, you are the elephant in a room full of mice, right? If you have a room full of mice and you have an elephant in there, who's paying attention to who? The mice are paying attention to every move that the elephant makes because it can just squash them at some point. So everything you do, everything you say will be subject to interpretation, reactions, responses, change in climate in the room. So if you took the leadership position, if you accepted it, guess what? You are the elephant. And all the little mice around you are looking at every movement you make, whether it's with your trunk, with your tail, or if you're walking around and drawing conclusions for that. So again, it is a huge honor to lead, but an even bigger responsibility. So,
Anna Dutra, thank you very much for being on Not Suitable for Work.
Thank you so much for having me.
Finding your authentic voice in business takes self-reflection and self-awareness. Reflect on what you say and the impact it has on those around you. If you're trying to use humor to be authentic and nobody laughs or it makes people uncomfortable, stop it and find another way to connect with your colleagues, maybe a shared interest. If your authentic voice is being transparent and sharing your entire self, stop that too, especially if you're in a leadership role. You have responsibilities to your company and your team. You're there to serve them, so stop spouting off. Okay, I'm done preaching like an executive coach. To learn more about toxic leaders and how to deal with them, I highly recommend Anna's book, Leadershits. You can find it on Amazon. If you want more Not Suitable for Work or have a work story to share, be sure to follow us on Facebook at Not Suitable for Work. You can find our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts. If you have a question you want answered on a future episode, please call us at 872-256-0827. I'm Peter C. Diamond. You can follow me on Twitter at Peter C. Diamond. Not Suitable for Work is produced by Matt Cunningham at Truthful Enthusiasm. Get your story online with truthfulenthusiasm.com. Until next time.